Good afternoon, Bahamas. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us again for our third org panel, Ask the Experts panel. And we're really excited to switch things up this time around and change the subject a little bit. Today, we'll be talking about education in the Bahamas in the time of COVID-19 and in the future and beyond. We have a group of great panelists for you today, representing diverse areas of the sector. And I'll just go ahead and introduce them. We have Director Marcellus Taylor, Director of Education here in the Bahamas. We have Etwal Pinder, the National Representative for UNICEF here in the Bahamas. We have Dr. Robert Robertson, President of BTVI. We have also Plachette McPhee, Dean of Academic Affairs at BTVI. We have our very own Tiffany A. Bain, Education Consultant here at ORG, the Organization for Responsible Governance. And last, and definitely not least, we have DeAndre Wilson Ihajirika, who is the co-founder of Beta Camp Bahamas, which is a group of young engineers changing the way that STEM and engineering education is done in the Bahamas. So thank you so much for coming, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're looking forward to a rousing conversation on a topic that I know resonates with everyone right now and is incredibly timely, given that education is shifting incredibly right now in the Bahamas, thanks to, well, a little bit of an emergency situation that we all call COVID-19. So I suppose I'll jump right in and ask, actually no, before I do ask my first question, I want to remind audience members that you have the opportunity to pose questions directly to the panelists. So we really encourage you to engage. If you post in the Facebook message, Facebook comment section, we will have people in there responding to your questions and also passing them up to me to pose to the panelists. So please feel free to pose questions in that space. And so with that, I will ask my first question, just as something to set the scene a little bit. If Director Taylor and Dr. Roberts and all other persons involved in education right now, if you can give us a little bit of an overview of how the public system and the educational institutions that you work for have responded to COVID-19. How has it changed the way that you operate currently? I'll throw that out to Director Taylor first. Director Taylor?
My mic. I was making the point that I think that the Ministry of Education has been able to respond to COVID-19 in three distinct ways. Key among them, of course, was moving our instruction from the campuses around the country to a virtual platform. And what I think gave us not just the competency and the confidence to do that was some of the work that we'd started in September with virtual learning. And so we created a virtual school to address teacher shortages in the more remote parts of the Bahamas, places like Crooked Island, Auckland, and some of the keys in Exuma. And then, of course, when Hurricane Dorian struck, we had another opportunity to expand our operations in that regard. So we worked with secondary school students in the Abaco area and are working with secondary school students in Abaco to provide them with instruction via the virtual learning platform. But then, of course, COVID-19 was a much bigger deal because we're talking about scaling up, and scaling up, as you know, in the development world, or the people here who are involved in that, know that you could kind of run a project, right? You could kind of have success in pockets, but you know, a big challenge comes when you try to scale up. And so we went for the whole hog, really. And we decided that we would use whatever background we had to try and offer instruction for students at all grade levels, 13 grade levels that we have, 14 grade levels that we have, and to all students across the Bahamas. And we closed schools. The last day of school was 13th of March. And by 23rd of March, we had the platform up. And by the next Monday, I think it was the 30th or 31st of, well, whatever the date was, we had live instruction at secondary level. and we've been trying to enhance and improve it ever since. So that's the one and the most prolific response that I think people would see and feel. The next response is really trying to ensure that more and more people have access, and that it's a little bit more difficult. Of course, in the Bahamas, we have a relatively high level of internet penetration, and a lot of people with devices. But that doesn't necessarily mean every single child would have a device or every single child would have access. And so, being cognizant of that, we knew that virtual learning activities, if they were just relegated to the internet, would serve perhaps a bulk of students, but not necessarily all. And in education, our intent is to not just meet the mass, but try to reach every single student. It doesn't mean that we will get there overnight, but it's our goal, and so we have to keep pursuing it. And so that's the reason why one of the things you would see is that we established a channel, and we're now launching the second one on cable TV, to put some of the content on there, so that those students who didn't have internet access could at least get some level of access to the learning. We also have made available to some of our students already devices, tablets, and in some cases laptops. And we've done that primarily in the southern islands. So some of those same students who were in the virtual school from September, we allowed them to take the devices home, and so their education was not interrupted at all. And then some others who in some other small communities, we enabled them to access devices. Of course, the minister has articulated the desire to make more devices available, but that's something that's predicated on resource availability and so forth, and these are some tough times. So, but anyway, we've made some effort to try and expand the access to the actual platform that we have. And then the third way we have responded, I would want to share, is the social welfare component. And so in terms of our school lunch feeding program, we were catering to about 4,200 students or so on lunch program on a weekly basis. And, we felt that for some of those students, this might be the best meal that they get in the day. And we already had the funds budgeted and so forth. So we just made an extra effort to ensure that they got it. In the first instance, we were trying to work it where, we still had it where the students got the meal, but now we made a slight adjustment and provided vouchers so that the families get food items. And in doing that, we feel that we are even helping more people, because if someone gets a voucher and they go in the food store, they may not be as healthy as we might like, but they can identify foods that could feed the whole family for some period of time. So it's bringing relief beyond our students, but that's fine because they live in households and the household has to be healthy. And when I say healthy, in a healthy state. And so those are the three things that I think what I would say symbolize our response to COVID-19 at this point.
That's a very broad-reaching response. I did have a quick follow-up question. When you were talking about increasing access and delivering more devices and obviously creating the second channel, have you seen that? Has that produced results? Have you seen an uptick in enrollment, or does it seem to have filled the gap or made a measurable difference? Sorry.
Well, okay, so yeah, so I would be one of the first to say that our data collection in this regard is not as strong as it needs to be, and it will be strengthened when we convert our platform from the current platform to another platform that we've been testing this week. It will give us a lot more information on the students who sign up and so on, and their frequency of use and all of these kind of things. What we noticed from the first day when we launched the virtual school, the number of students and this is self-registration, people go on and they register themselves. The number of persons who self-registered in the beginning was something like 11,000 at the start date. Now the number of students who have registered is something in the order of 46,000. So each week we've been seeing people adding numbers going up. We also know that there are teachers and others who are engaged in their own private sort of one-on-one type thing with their class.
Hmm.
And so we don't know if those persons are necessarily in that number or not. But what we do know is that the overall number of persons identifying or registering has increased. And we have the confidence that this means that even if they don't go on every day, that there is some degree of engagement by a growing number of persons on the platform. And it could be in part the multiple efforts coming together in different ways to support that.
Thank you. I'm going to pose the same question to Dr. Robertson for BTVI. How have you all coped with COVID-19, and what have you all done to adapt in this new age of social distancing?
Well, first of all, thanks to the ORG for hosting this very timely session. I think there's a lot of discussion that needs to happen around the kinds of things we just heard from Director Taylor. At BTVI, we serve approximately 5,000 students a year, and we have had regularly about 50 classes that would be online or blended for the past 2 or 3 years. So we have had some experience coming into COVID. We use a learning management system called Moodle, and we have had a number of faculty members trained with respect to Moodle. Now, of course, with COVID-19, it changed things dramatically. We had 300 courses running at the time of COVID and the lockdown. 275 of them went online literally within 72 hours. So we were very pleased with the ability of the faculty to quickly move content into the platform, notwithstanding the fact that it came as a big surprise to everyone, faculty and students alike. We have a very strong IT team under a new Dean of IT and Distance Education, Anthony Ramtula. We have a very good academic dean, Dr. Plachette McPhee, and they really led the charge to get us online in a real positive and quick way. We were able to also do some of the things that you heard from Director Taylor, and I think we'll talk about this later in the conversation. But there are some challenges with respect to technology, obviously in the Bahamas or elsewhere. And so we have a system where students have some access to loaners, computers that they can take home, Chromebooks, and help them. We've tried to find for them hotspots that they can utilize for internet access and things like that. I know we'll get into some more detail later in the panel, but I do want to say we've just surveyed those students who were on lockdown, and the survey results with respect to the experience have been remarkably positive. I know I hear some negative comments, but more than 80% of the students who took courses online and were forced to do so by COVID, more than 80% said it was a good experience and we'd like to do more. So that's a pretty telling, kind of direction for us to try to think about. We also have two campuses other than in Nassau. We have one in Freeport, another big one in Freeport, but we have a campus in Andros and a campus in Abaco. And for me, I think one of the big opportunities in the Bahamas is to really reflect on how we can get content to those family islands, because otherwise they don't have the capacity to be involved in tertiary training. And so we are really looking at this experience with respect to COVID as an opportunity to try to penetrate some of the islands. And we've been talking with the Ministry of Education about the best ways to do that. So overall, I think, although like everyone, we were surprised by the severity and extent of this lockdown, I think we've responded reasonably well, and the survey data, which we've just received this week from students, I think is quite positive. There's more work to be done, but to me, it's an opportunity as much as it is a challenge.
Thank you. And I think that you actually provided an excellent segue into the next question that I have, and this is for all the panelists. Obviously, both of the solutions that you all mentioned are adapting with technology to social distance learning, to distance learning, I suppose, and blended learning styles. I think that we immediately think of technology when we think of the recent changes to education, but I suppose are there bigger changes that are happening within that? I know that pedagogical changes may need to be made, the ways that people are teaching, organizational or other skill changes. So I guess that's my first question. And then as a larger question for everyone is, based on this change in style, I suppose, of learning and teaching transmission, where do we see the major areas of challenge? And by contrast, the major areas of opportunity for innovation in education thus far? Like, what are we learning, I suppose, as we make this transition and as we go through these growing pains? And
can I take that one?
I'm gonna throw that out to Tiffany, because I know that org has had a survey, so you have some pretty direct data to draw from.
Well, yes. I actually wanted to start off with some World Bank data. Attending the panel that they had last week, I wasn't aware of the actual statistics around the number of teachers who were prepared to teach students remotely. But World Bank actually presented that only about 1/3 of teachers internationally have the either skill or capacity to be able to revert from a traditional classroom setting to be able to teach in a remote environment. And I think that's probably one of the most important statistics to think about within this educational space, because we've been operating under a number of assumptions that everybody or all teachers were equally mentally, emotionally, and professionally equipped to just walk out of a classroom and be able to recreate that experience within a home environment. And I think that's just one of the greatest things to be able to highlight during this time, even in the world of access to technology, both on the side of teachers and students. We were able to identify a bit of a disparity and gaps in the abilities and capacities of teachers and students to be able to navigate online successfully. And so when we talk about what school looks like online right now, we have data that's showing that only about 30% of students are doing some sort of evaluated learning. And again, some of this data isn't good or bad, but it's just kind of good to know who is doing evaluated work as opposed to like learning for engagement during this space versus the number of kids who just aren't online. So the information about who's learning, how they're learning, what they're learning, and what's the impact of this learning, I think are just like the key information that we should be kind of thinking about within the very same space of we're moving on to blended learning environments. Because what I do know is in most instances, this does not look like, or nor do any of the parties, nor is anybody attempting to replicate an in-class or in-school normal environment.
I would say that this thing about making assumptions is problematic, because when you're planning, planning requires assumption making. Right? That's all planning is all about, really, making a lot of assumptions and what if based on the resources, etc. We would get our information about what teachers are able to do based on what teachers have done. And I think in our particular case, the teachers who seemed to respond and the teachers who joined the teams that we put together to generate the curriculum were those who either had the skill or who had the confidence. And I think since COVID-19, we've put on about 32, I believe, workshops for teachers, discrete, separate workshops with an average attendance of about 500. And but we have a force of about 3,200. So it means that there are a large number of teachers who are not engaging. Some of it is fair, some of it is, I guess, indifferent. Some of it might be lack of device. But the assumption you make is that it should be relatively easy for people to make that conversion, and from classroom teaching straight into the virtual. And for a lot of people, it's not. And we have to find ways to address that.
I mean, I can say that org has definitely stepped up in that space. We have done workshops for learning design in a flexible context, And I want to emphasize that that level of skill isn't necessarily one that was completely transferable. And so in normal teacher education, this is not a circumstance that anybody was expecting. And so that's not a normal part of teacher curriculum. It's called instructional design or learning design. And most teachers who have that skill would have specialized in that or had a very specific interest in that area. And so as Director Taylor pointed out, there were some degrees of fair, but there's also a degree of just not having those skills in practice or in their actual academic studies for this level of learning.
So at BTVI, our intent this term was to save the term. I don't think by any stretch of the imagination are we teaching online or doing blended teaching, because that's very different. There are two different concepts here. The COVID response was a COVID response. We were forced into it. Faculty was prepared to some extent, but not ready. Students were not ready. And so over the term as well, one of the other things we did is we've been extensively involved in training, as you just heard from Director Taylor. We have about 30 students who are faculty members who were involved directly with the Commonwealth of Learning. We're doing extensive training that started around February to build capacity internally and train the trainer capacity. We also have other training ongoing now that includes being prepared for the next term, because obviously this is not a short-term event. And so going into the fall, we'll have an extensive set of training now to get people ready to put their materials in place to offer a much better product in the fall. I mean, I've been teaching online for about 20 years. And I think what we've done in the past few months has been remarkable, frankly, but it's by no stretch of the imagination online learning or blended learning. It's really a Band-Aid approach. But again, I think we've done an awesome job. So going forward is a different question. And I think that's where the Bahamas needs to really reflect on what, advantages we can draw in terms of digitization and better use of online learning. There are some real opportunities to do that, but it'll still require some fairly significant work and effort and direction.
I could just chime in really quickly because there's a lot of really great points. And I agree with your point, Dr. Robertson, in that, we had to react really quickly. And I think, again, to Director Taylor's point, we did an amazing job in reacting. It's been very impressive to see the teachers be able to convert their content to online in a short amount of time. It's amazing. I think that's when we talk about opportunities that are coming out of this, I think that's one of the big things that we see. Like, we actually do have the capability to make these changes and to move and to adapt our curriculum to the needs of the country. And I think that's one thing, as you said, Dr. Robson, as we reflect on moving forward, we need to look at our entire curriculum and how we can adapt it. We've shown that we can change and make some positive changes, and especially coming from the perspective of a STEM professional. And we're seeing this reliance on technology and the benefits of technology, being able to reach some of those students in remote areas. I think we need to make sure that we are also not just looking at how we teach our curriculum, but what we're teaching in our curriculum, and making sure that we are making sure that the skills that are being addressed through these curriculums will help those students in the long term. And in addition to that, some of the changes that we've seen, obviously with working from home and having students learning from home, there's an involvement of the parents as well. And you kind of touched on it a little bit, Director Taylor, in terms of, teachers having the confidence, but I think also with parents having the confidence to support their students in this online learning is an important aspect as well. So having those opportunities for continuing education for parents as well, so they can have the confidence to support their teachers as we adapt and change the curriculum to meet these new times.
Yeah, and I was thinking about this the other day, and I was saying, in addition to deliberate training for teachers, perhaps we need to design or find there's some courses that we can put on for parents, because I think we're leaving it to chance, and I think we should be a little bit more deliberate.
I agree. And again, to your point about access to technologies, with a lot of people not necessarily having access to maybe multiple tablets or multiple computers. That's another thing that, you know, needs to be addressed with the parents as well. And also looking at partnerships with social enterprises, community centers, you know, looking at our library systems. Those are opportunities, again, to get the parents involved, as well as to make sure that students have access to these resources. If we do have communal centers where they can go to get access to a computer or things of that nature.
So we are starting to forward think already, thinking about how we're translating our emergency response into what it looks like in the future. But I'm going to just quickly do a question from the audience, which actually roots very much in our current response. And that is, sorry, let me pull it up. What aspects or functionality, based on the challenges and opportunities that you're seeing now, what aspects or functionality should schools consider when they are choosing teaching and learning educational technologies? So I suppose what aspects should they be looking for in the technologies that they're using to deliver their content? If there's anyone out there that would like to field that.
So
go on.
We'll introduce in another week some nano certificates from BTVI that'll be publicly available. So these nano certificates are a series of 3 or 4 courses that are industry certified that I think address this question, and they're very basic. And so they're things like Microsoft Word, Excel, some of the basic things, PowerPoint, that you need to know if you're a teacher or if you're a student that's going into school. McKinsey and Company recently released last week a survey and a report on the economy of the post-COVID economy in Europe that said what'll happen is the skills gap in Europe will increase. Currently, they report 65% of employers feel that there is a skills gap in Europe that will increase based on post-COVID economy. And they really feel that there's a need for governments to introduce basic digital literacy at the elementary and high school levels, carried through to the tertiary levels and the technical levels. I mean, even on the technical side, we didn't really address this when I first spoke, but there's some courses at BTVI that are difficult to push online, you know, and people tell me this all the time: welding, carpentry, plumbing. But there are courses you can take in welding online using virtual simulators. So it's not impossible. It requires the technology, it requires the training to be able to do that. There's a big paradigm shift coming, future, that we need to be prepared for in the Bahamas to stay up with the kinds of skills that employers are going to be asking for to get people back to work. And I think we all have a real opportunity, as I said, but a real challenge to be able to address those changes, because when the economy opens again, employers are still going to be looking for skilled employees. And so that problem that we have had in the Bahamas and elsewhere will continue, and it will be exacerbated according to this McKinsey survey that came out about a week ago.
Thank you. Someone else had wanted to chime in?
So we have been using at org in our pre-apprenticeship program, we've been using a blended learning experience. And I think this is probably one of the best pathways that schools should be looking toward, incorporating these experiences in their regular classrooms, but also embracing the idea of a range of pedagogical approaches like project-based learning and maybe Montessori style learning, and definitely applied learning, so that students are practicing mastered skills, perhaps in a digital world. So practicing mastered skills like math and language arts and spelling, and then using more applied learning in other spaces, typically in formative learning like primary school. The purpose of social studies and sciences is to actually, that's actually to enhance your literacy, because those, that content is not necessarily hands-on applied in that environment. You use that a little bit later in life. So that's used to develop how you understand the world and navigate the world. So if we get more flexible about how we instruct our students and how we assess learning and what our expectations are for student learning, I think that's probably the first step that schools can make, going to a more skills-based approach and not focusing on the just assessing content and comprehension, but digging a little bit deeper, looking very, very closely at our syllabus and seeing what are the skills in the syllabus and starting off with that, as opposed to what some of our habits have been historically, which are starting with the content. Let's just look at what the subject is and then just finding ways to teach the content in that way. And it's something that teachers are historically guilty of. I know as a social science teacher, I've done that in history and social studies, and it's something that we've practiced. So kind of shifting out of that and looking at the very specific skills to help students use those in those spaces while practicing maybe a blended learning, as I mentioned, for math and language arts, I think is a really good combination and a great way for schools to be able to launch those skills.
I just really want to echo what Tiffany has said because I agree with it wholeheartedly. Looking at different teaching styles like project-based learning, inquiry-based learning, these are so important. And I really love that she touched on looking at the skills that we need to develop. Again, coming from that STEM-based lens and looking at, how we want to learn in the future, how we need to address challenges in the future. STEM is a big part of that. And are we actually teaching the skills that students will need to be a part of some of these STEM careers? And I think, again, taking that skills-based lens, it allows for teachers to have flexibility in how they teach. It allows for us to use these project-based approaches, these inquiry-based approaches, instead of just going rote through a curriculum or you have to read these 3 chapters or you have to do it this way. If we're just looking for the skills and that the students are developing those skills, you can come up with various approaches that meets that student's learning style. And I think that's really, really, really important. And I think that is a way that we can shift towards in the future. And if we are going to be looking at blended learning approaches and some of the technologies that we want in the classroom or outside of the classroom, we want to make sure that we're using tools that will allow the flexibility of these different learning styles and learning approaches. Do the tools that we're using allow for collaboration? Does it allow for some element of hands-on? And I like that also Ms. Dr. Robertson touched on some of the new technologies that people are using to try and get a little bit of hands-on, even when you're in a virtual format. Again, from my background as an engineer, I've worked in various industries, and they do use technologies where we incorporate VR into training and some of these new technologies where you can have an idea of a bit of a hands-on approach where you aren't able to be in the classroom all the time. And again, if we go back to the skills, and I think I saw someone post in the comments about some entrepreneurial opportunities. How can we bring some of those technologies to the Bahamas as well, making sure that we are training people to have the skills to, again, feed back into our educational systems? Can we start companies that will develop these virtual platforms that will create VR? Again, it's a continuous loop. Are we making sure that the curriculum is setting the skills? Can those skills then develop new entrepreneurial or business opportunities that can then feed back into our educational system, potentially through, I think Tiffany mentioned, like apprenticeship programs and things like that. So I think there's a lot of great things that we can look forward to.
And I just wanted to bring up that as we are learning from COVID and moving to different styles of learning, to just be mindful of the issues that existed in the global educational system prior to COVID and in the Bahamas too, with the differences in learning outcomes and skill attainment for people of different socioeconomic backgrounds. So we can use this opportunity as new different methods are brought into the classroom to try and reduce that gap so that we don't see this continual perpetuation of those from lower income backgrounds being stuck in the poverty cycle, but we can potentially use these different mechanisms to better empower everybody so that at the end of it, everybody's skills attainment is at a higher level that the employers need, that the country is going to need as we go through this global recession.
I actually want to expand a little bit on that. It's fall. One of the questions that I had meant to pose was essentially about the access to broadband being not necessarily equal across different socioeconomic quintiles, as you alluded to, despite the fact that quality education is a fundamental human right. Director Taylor spoke on it a little bit, but I feel as if as we spoke, as many of the panelists spoke just now, we kind of touched on the idea of equality for different, I suppose, learning abilities and et cetera, and the ways that technology is exacerbating some, alleviating others. So I suppose as we look at the way that we're responding to this and the opportunities that are being presented, how are we feeling about these shifts and the ways that we can move them forward in a way that does address inequalities, both socioeconomic and otherwise, I suppose?
Well, it's really tough, especially for anybody who in the panel is also a parent. If you just think about it now, if you're fortunate enough to still have a job, so let's just say that, but you are trying to work while homeschooling your child and you are the single father or single mother in charge of those children. I mean, there's so many aspects that come into why those who are in a lower socioeconomic starting place right now during COVID, whether or not you have access to internet, which we know unfortunately, and the director in the Department of Education has done an incredible job in trying to provide the tablets and working with us as NGOs. So UNICEF, IsraAid, the Island School, One Eleuthera Foundation, Life Key Foundation, so many different partners are coming in with Alive and Cable Bahamas to try and ensure that the access to technology isn't the limitation, but that only goes so far. There's so many other things that unfortunately we need to be mindful of when we're asking parents to homeschool. One of the things that I like that Tiffany, you were bringing about, not just the skills level of teachers and being able to do, but the home. I mean, I started off my conversation with Shantez today being like, this is as good as my apartment gets. Like, I don't have a nice clean background, but you can imagine we're dealing in Abaco. So we're giving out tablets next week to almost 400 children who currently don't have access to a device and don't have access to the internet. Some of them are still in tents, they're living in shelters, their ability to participate in a classroom setting, a virtual classroom setting is very, very different from the peer who, lives off of Prince Charles. So how are we able to be mindful of these different things while we're creating these additional opportunities? But I think this is where the Director Taylor and his team have done a really good job of, for example, one of the big issues internationally is the nutrition of children during COVID. And we cannot underestimate the negative impact that hunger has on ability to learn. I mean, it seems very basic, but it really is a huge issue. Hungry children cannot learn. And so the fact that the Ministry of Education took such a strong stance in making sure that it was like within 2 weeks, I think, Director, that you had those food vouchers going to the children who were on the school lunch program. These kinds of things are really important. But we as a community in the country, I'm also on the Food Security Committee. We have a very specific name that I'm not remembering now. But one of the things that we're really focused on is ensuring that children are going to be able to have access to food, and not just those who are already enrolled with the food voucher program, but now that there's hundreds of more people unemployed and food security has really become a problem. How do we help these mitigating factors get eased so that there is equity across the learning opportunities?
I think this also sort of exposes a kind of unspoken reality that we have in the Bahamas, where we do have really two groups of people. We do have a have and a have not. And we kind of, gloss over that most of the time. But when we get in crisis time, and I think Dorian helped to expose it in the Abaco area, but certainly COVID has certainly exposed it across the country. And the questions we have to ask ourselves, and, education is always within a context, right? So the questions we have to ask ourselves about these kind of disparities in our society. And if we could seek to begin to explore them in the generic sense, the general sense of what happens in the country, then we could have a little bit more answers as to what do we do in the space of education. Because I think even in some cases, if we were to give some of those students a device, the structure of the home or the lack of structure of the home because of whatever other reasons going on, that investment still may not yield the kind of benefit that we're expecting. So I think we have to look at this broader context in which we operate and how do we reduce the inequalities across our society, and then we'll begin to see more benefits in the education sector.
In our case at BTVI, we also are working with partners. And so one of the partners obviously is the MOE, the Ministry of Education. The minister is very supportive of digital, learning. But we've also worked with some other agencies. For example, the Rotary Club Disaster Foundation has recently provided us with a donation to purchase Chromebooks so that we can push Chromebooks out, particularly to students in Freeport and Abaco, based on the hurricane, disaster of last fall. And I think as both of the last two speakers have indicated, the kind of solutions that we're going to have to craft in the Bahamas is not like a government solution, or it's not like an education solution. It's a solution that really needs the support of, family members, businesses. It needs to be a broad-based societal, kind of a change. And I'm hoping, and I think that COVID-19 is kind of big enough of a problem that it'll highlight that as a holistic, kind of resolution, as Director Taylor just mentioned.
Thank you. Sorry.
No, I also think, and piggybacking on Drs. Robertson and Taylor, I think a really big thing coming out of this is we know that Ministry of Education serves the entire country. I think we have an opportunity for more pockets of like centralized information and localized information on the various jurisdictions in the Bahamas. So what's happening, or he mentioned, Director Taylor mentioned community, the context. So I think we have opportunities for lots of partnerships in communities so that we know exactly what's happening in a very localized fashion, what's happening in Abaco. And I think there's an opportunity here for greater partnerships of non-governmental organizations and civil society, as well as corporate partners, to kind of collaborate a little bit better on how do we support our schools and our individual communities to get some of these outcomes. Because the Ministry of Education is always going to create policy that is going to be broad reaching. I mean, that's essentially what it is that they have to do, because their goal is to impact the entire Bahamas. But we know that there are going to be communities with different levels of need, and the ministry won't always be able to tailor to those needs. We need more collective action toward how do we then go ahead and support what the needs of these individual communities, what those individual communities are. And I don't know if that comes just from international aid. And I know in the wake of Dorian, it definitely has. I think Bahamian communities and organizations and consortiums need to start looking at what are ways that we can support our local communities and our schools in these local communities to be able to bring access and resources to students and families in these spaces in the way that the government structure might not be able to access as rapidly.
And just to kind of piggyback off of that, what Tiffany is saying, and I think Director Taylor mentioned it as well, but just listening to the conversation, it just makes me think about the importance of data-driven decision making. And Director Taylor kind of touched on it as well, in that they're trying to get better data on how the students are using the tools that they have right now, or how many students are actually using the tools. And is that data correlating with some of the data that we currently have on the different constituencies, the different areas, the different demographics of people, with other social supports that they're accessing? Are we looking at that information to better understand the full picture of what's going on in certain areas? Do we have that data documented somewhere so that government officials can use it to make informed decisions on how they want to support these different demographics of people? And so I think that's something for us to consider as we go forward. Like, how are we collecting our information? Are we using it in a constructive way? Or do we need to relook at how we're collecting that information so that we can make informed decisions with it?
And that, to agree, oh, sorry, Director. I was just going to wholeheartedly agree that evidence-based decision-making is going to be so key, especially now with limited resources. This is, I think, one of the interesting things, Tiffany, sort of combining both of what you'd said, is the international NGO community, and I am a little bit a part of it, even as a Bahamian with being with UNICEF. They'd never been in a disaster zone that had seen such an incredible response from local NGOs. Like, this is unheard of what the Bahamas was doing here. But at the same time, I think we have to be really cognizant now of the economic restrictions that COVID is going to be placing within our communities. So it's that much more important for us to have good data, to really make really well, not just thought out, but really well prepared decisions. And I'm sure Director Taylor is more than sort of thinking about this all the time. But for me, I know the ministers brought it up. What we have this unique blend here too of private and public schools in the country, but we know that with the economic restrictions, how many individuals now are really going to be able to continue to send their children to private schools come September. Where is that then going to shift into increases within the public sector? And it really just tones down that we are such a small country. You know, it is still one education system, and how do we bring communities together to serve the better purpose of our children, all of the children who are our future job holders, who are the future in every way for us. So really being able to use data though to make those decisions, I think is going to be the only way forward.
As we speak about using data and addressing educational inequality, I have a question from the audience that actually helps to segue into the next question that I have as well. This audience member says, what is going to be done to prevent vulnerable students from dropping out, which is common after this type of epidemic? Is there a task force focused on this issue? I'd like to broaden this question out a little bit. I mean, please address that directly, but I'd like to ask the more basic question of what would a reopening process look like for educational institutions? I know that we're about to go into summer for those who are secondary and below. Tertiary, some types of tertiary will continue through the summer. But in other countries, we're seeing institutions prioritizing which classes open up and opening up in a phased way, such as the technical courses that Dr. Robertson stated before, like carpentry or welding, being allowed to go back in the classroom, but maybe keeping some of the other courses remote. And others restructuring classrooms and schedules to comply with social distancing. So, you know, with all of this to consider, how do we see this playing out in the Bahamas? What do we see being priorities, I suppose, as far as preparing our various school systems for the reentry of students to the classroom when that happens? And once again, if you could address the audience members' question about, as we do that, how are we going to be addressing vulnerable students who may not be able to re-enter the classroom, or may not re-enter the classroom?
On the retention side, we've started a program to monitor attendance and participation and other metrics with respect to online, to catch those who might be vulnerable of dropping out earlier. And so in some respects, if you just set the online systems up, you know, the right way, you can generate data to monitor, you know, that it historically has been a cold technology though. I mean, you're talking to a screen and you don't have the kind of support perhaps of people in the room, but I think going forward, to get to your second question, we will obviously have to rely on government guidance about reopening. But at BTVI, the summer school is totally online. We have 40 courses available. They're all online. In the fall, we're looking to be fully online as well. I mean, we may not be, but in the event that we have to be, it looks like we'll be fully online and we'll be ready for it. If we can, we'd like to supplement it with social distancing types of courses that maybe are in the trades in particular. But I think given the sequence of events up until March, it only is proper for us to look at having a plan that basically is fully online. I mean, you've probably seen in the news that some big university systems like California are already going online for all of the fall. And in fact, I just heard they're probably going online for the entire year. So, you know, we have to be prepared to do that. It's going to be a long haul I also just want to raise, if I can, a positive story, because sometimes we get down about all of this situation. We've had a program of dual enrollment at BTVI for the last 3 years, which this year will have 500 students in it. So 3 years ago, we started with 150 in Freeport and Nassau. And this is called an ICT program for high school students. So in the summer, they take 5 courses, all of which are industry certified. And the next summer, they take another set. And then finally, in this year, we've got the graduating class finishing. So they'll have 15 credits from BTVI, almost all of which are industry certified. And they'll also graduate from high school at exactly the same time. To me, this is the kind of proactive thing that we need to do over time. A lot of governments, and this is not at the Bahamas, but a lot of governments jump in with a one-off solution. Let's do this. They put a lot of money and energy into it, and then it drops. This program's been going on for 3 years. I'm positive it's going to pay substantial dividends for these kids going through this course. And they're also doing extremely well, by the way. The other criticism I keep hearing is that, oh, these kids can't do it in the Bahamas. They don't have the technology. They don't have, whatever. But these kids are doing extremely well. And we've got to be, really pushing this model, I think, for the future, because this is really, especially with COVID, I think this is really the way forward. And I just I couldn't let this panel go by without raising this. We're really proud of this cohort of students.
Yes, and thank you very much for that, because that speaks a lot to the direction we want to move in terms of developing a much stronger way of knowing who is engaged in what learning activities we have going on now. We are very concerned about vulnerable students and being able to reach them. And we have to think about ways in which we can do that. And we believe that even partnering with the social services ministry and so forth could help us, because the vulnerable students are usually the ones with all the other kind of demographic challenges, poverty, and whatever. So if we could identify them, but this is why we have to install this LMS that we're putting in place very soon, because that would be the core bit of information. Even moving forward though, as Dr. Robinson indicates, we don't know how long this is going to happen. But even if we return to schools, we have the suspicion that this notion of social distancing is going to be around for a while. And the challenge that we have with that is not the medical challenge, right? The accommodating of students challenge that we have with that is that it basically will demand us to increase our space inventory by double our space inventory. And if you have more classrooms, then naturally you need more teachers or persons to supervise the activity of those students. And this will then become an impossibility in an environment where we're being told that we have to cut our budgets by 20%. And Dr. Robertson will know the struggles we have in to try and cut back, because we, in the case of the Department of Education, 88% of our budget this year goes to paying salaries and emoluments to staff. And so we already only have 12% of our staff that we are told that we cannot, that we can make adjustments to. But you still have to run a system. You still have to have toilet paper. You still have to have bleach. You still have to have other resources and so forth to use. So how do you cut this 20%? And so cutting the 20% is a challenge. So imagine now having to increase the space that you occupy and increase the numbers of persons to deliver on that. So a blended learning solution may have to be one that we put in place as long as there is issues around the social distancing. And once we do that, we know that there's a vulnerability, because while they may come to school the 2 days or 3 days that you ascribe them to come to school, what happens on those other days? And it's not just a matter of whether they come to school or not come to school. It's what happens when they're not in the school environment. And while we may think that it's not our job to take care of your children, and I guess it's not whilst they're not in school, for some people, school is the safest, most structured environment that they're in all day. This is a concern. So it really makes it, from a strategic point of view, very difficult to figure out how you're going to address all these matters, because they're not just localized to what you can do and what you can control. And even the parts that you can do and the parts that you can control are also iffy because of these financial constraints and these medical demands or these public health demands that are being placed on us at this time. It's not to say that we can't find solutions. It's just to say that there will always be some level of vulnerability at this point, because that's just how things are. Once you switch from one method and go to another method, then you have to build to the fullness of that method to have the full effect. It will take a time. And who is normally left out when you make a change is those who are least able to make it in the original method that you're using. They would be the ones who will have the greater difficulty converting to the new way. And so as a society, and that's why in my earlier talk, this thing about inequality is something that we have to address because it manifests itself in so many different ways. And this will also be one of the ways that it will manifest itself.
I have an audience question that is, how can we support early childhood development throughout this process? It being recognized as one of the most important investments in education.
And Shonda, I was actually just going to follow up from Director Taylor a little bit with bringing up, especially that issue with early childhood education. Because we're seeing it in Abaco in particular, which is where a lot of my focus is, but there was over 20 private early childhood education centers in central Abaco prior to Dorian, and 0 of them exist now. So this was already an issue that the districts, I do also just want to say the district superintendent and every principal and teacher in Abaco are the most amazing set of inspiring individuals. Just to go off of Dr. Robertson's positive thing, like you just need to have an interaction with any of them and you're re-inspired. But one of the concerns that the district superintendent and I there have chatted about quite a bit is like, what are we able to do? Because the proof is early childhood education for lower income households is that most important thing, because by the time you're 5 and you go into grade 1, if you already have a vocabulary, which is up to here, because you've learned it by being in a kindergarten setting or some form of preschool, you carry that all the way through into your incomes. Like your earnings later in life can be tied directly to whether or not you had access to early childhood education. And unfortunately, I definitely don't have the answer, but this is, I think, something which I'm really hoping we can have a good task force or specific group of people. Maybe Director Taylor already knows that there is one, but being able to bridge that gap, in particular for the low income and vulnerable households, giving parents the simple things that singing to your children, counting anything that you have in your garden with your kids, these little things that you can do, even if they're 2, 3, 4 years old, really will have an impact. And how can we systemize that and provide some form of guidance to parents, especially during this really tough time, I think is going to be key for the future of the Bahamas 10 years from now, when those 5-year-olds are 15.
In speaking to one of the educators, I can't remember which island it was, they made the point that, one of the good things that came out of this is that now we have the pre-primary instruction online. Students who couldn't get access before are now getting access to pre-primary. The government was doing a lot of investment in pre-primary. We started a program where we were pretty much paying private institutions $2,000 per preschool student, and that was going very well. Over a 2-year period, we expanded the number of students accessing pre-primary by 1,500, which is a significant portion of that cohort. And then now with the virtual learning, those children who were staying at home, at least getting some kind of structured program to follow, which we think is of good quality. I heard a couple of times this question about a task force. And what I want to say about that is, although we haven't formed a local one as yet to deal with the reopening of schools, we belong to CARICOM. And CARICOM at present has a task force of educational planners around the region, developing a kind of framework and set of guidelines to assist member states in this whole process of reopening. And our assistant director, Ms. Charmaine Sinclair, represents us on that committee. And they're working to come up with something that then we will use to impose on our local context.
Can I chime in right there? I think this the early childhood education and underserved students go back to a similar space that we've referenced before, talking about focusing on student skills that gives us the opportunity to be versatile about how we deliver those skills. Like the example is using television as a medium for showing or demonstrating those skills, and then thinking about more creative ways to be able to assess what that learning looks like. I know this is something that we've considered in this space at org in our learning through play. So we designed a similar strategy, and we were working with the early childhood education section of the Ministry of Education in this very same way, kind of finding ways in a very like Sesame Street style to be able to demonstrate pre-primary school skills so that students would be able to acquire those in a remote setting or outside of a regular school setting. So we have already started, you know, kind of getting very innovative about that and kind of thinking about like, what do those skills look like? I think this this speaks the same to when we talked about earlier about our underserved populations. Statistically, I mean, and arguably, we have we have at least 50% of our student population, and that number is arguably higher if we consider the number of students who have withdrawn from school prior to high school graduation. So we have about 50% of our student population who was already underserved by the current structure of the academic system. I think this is a really great opportunity in the Bahamas. I know traditionally we have always not been risk takers because we've always been very privileged in our systems, in our economy. But I do think this is a very good opportunity for our country to get incredibly innovative, leading with data-driven methods, leading with the data that we have, and get very creative about how we deliver education to students. We are going to be looking at statistical losses everywhere, and we can start with very creative approaches, looking at more Montessori styles in our current preschool structures so that we can have demonstrated learning in that very specific way. Looking at hybrid opportunities, as Dr. Robertson mentioned, he's talking about an ICT cohort that's been 10 through 12 that's gone to BTVI in the summers. What does that look like for those same levels of cohorts who may attend BTVI in a dual enrollment capacity at 10th grade the entire way? So we can get creative about that, because at this point, I hate to speak loosely and say we have nothing to lose, but I'd rather frame that as like, we have so much that we can gain from this. We have a great opportunity to recover a larger share of that 50% of students who are underserved by the structure that exists right now. Let's take some really innovative but very data-driven and well-implemented chances right now in education.
Yeah, and I concur. I think especially if we are able to have a platform, a virtual platform that can serve as the base where all your core subjects would be presented. We could do a lot of stuff with a lot of small institute type things. So if you're interested in culinary arts, a group of 20 students could be in a learning environment. If you're interested in sports, if you're an elite athlete, you can be in another environment. If you're interested in, technology, nanotechnology or whatever, something could be great. If you're a dancer and into the arts, and we can do that so that the system moves more to serving the needs and interests of the students, as opposed to everyone getting their education in this big kind of church school or state school environment, which of necessity then has to provide a set of courses, a set of structures that may not really cater specifically to the needs of the student. And so this does present an opportunity. And, of course, the state alone wouldn't be able to do it because of, state mechanisms are so, well, they're what they are. People bemoan them. They are what they are because then on the other end, the state has this accountability issue around resources being used and so forth. So if there are some opportunities for individuals and businesses to do some things differently, that can help us to come up with a new education system, these are the kinds of things that I believe we could be entertaining at this time.
Just
Thank
to kind
you.
of piggyback
Oh,
off of,
go ahead, Deandra.
yeah, I mean, I just wanted to echo, some of the things that were said already. I definitely agree, that we can use this as an opportunity to innovate, change our curriculum, look at the way we teach. I mean, if we talk about data and we look at some of the metrics that we've been using to assess, like BJCs, BGCSEs, like our performance has been not the greatest. Let's just put it that way. And so, we need to look at how we're teaching, what we're teaching, how we're assessing, all of these points that Tiffany raised. And, when we talk about early childhood education, I love that Tiffany brought up the idea of, bringing in television as a tool. If I put on my parent hat for a second, like I've used that as a tool for my children and it's shown great results. I use it in some of my programming outside of the classroom as well for STEM education. These are tools that we can try to leverage, when we try to be more innovative in how we teach. And again, looking at different ways that we assess. But, on top of that, when I will definitely never go against like the values of technology, but there's definitely value in some of these technological approaches to teaching as well. And so we don't want to completely throw those out the window. But again, when we look at that, and I think Director Taylor touched on it, Tiffany touched on it a little bit, understanding the resources that we can put in to continue to have some of those different types of teaching and learning mechanisms for different types of learners. And I'm going to plug in for Oregon about like the fiscal responsibility of the government and understanding where are we spending our resources. Like, Director Taylor did talk about, we're going to need to make some budget cuts. Where are we making those budget cuts? And where are we reallocating resources? Where are we trying to streamline? And we talk about the vulnerable student population and, families or parents needing to access other social services to make sure that their children can get access to education or that they can support their children in their education. Are we putting resources into those social services so that we can, build up these children in education? Where are we putting those resources? And I think that's a question again, and we talk about, data-driven, evidence-driven decision-making, understanding where we're funneling our money and if it's actually having the desired effects that we want, and maybe looking at that and changing how we spend our money as well, I think will be an important conversation for us to have moving forward.
I'm going to chime in there and say thank you so much for mentioning the citizen responsibility for pressuring, I guess, the way that we're spending our money and being vigilant about the way that we're spending our money. I'm going to use that as an opportunity to plug the fact that org will be, our panel next week will actually be about the budget next week, Friday. And we will also be launching a survey next week asking people how they would like for money to be prioritized. I think that we can all agree on this panel. I'm sure everyone in the audience can agree that education is somewhere that we want to see, maintaining priority, because we do know that with COVID-19, budgets will have to be cut across the board. If we can find a way to influence the government's decisions as they're doing that, to make it very clear that education is important to us and the other things that are important to us, hopefully we can influence that a little bit and change the outcomes. I'm going to, I guess, shift gears a little bit, since I'm tying it into a future panel, also tie into our past panels. So in previous panels, there has been consistent talk about economic diversification post-COVID, how this has highlighted the need for us to branch into new spaces, and by extension, the need to ensure workforce development to fill potential future skill needs. Now, this has definitely been touched on by a number of the panelists, but if we can stop to explore this a little bit more, how do we see institutions adapting to this currently and in the future? And how are we ensuring that we are shifting to meet new skills needs, both in direct response to COVID-19, but even in a longer term sense? And I have a question from the audience there that ties in with this, saying, how can we work with the private sector specifically to align with workforce skills needs in the coming years?
Maybe if no one wants to jump in first, I would love to talk to this point. Especially with COVID-19, and the unknown nature of how long we're going to be doing social distancing and how that's going to look in the future. There has been some discussion of saying, is this kind of the peak of globalization? Have we reached the peak of where we're sharing globally, but we need to start looking more internally? And I think I agree with that. I'm not saying that it's the end of globalization, but I think, you know, especially in the Bahamas, where we have a bit of a sort of culture of foreign is better in some ways, and where we import an extreme amount of our resources, we need to look at how we can continue to develop internally and how we can stand up our internal resources, both our natural resources as well as our human resources. So investing in our people and making sure that they do have the skills to meet the needs of the future. And of course, you know, I think STEM being a big part of that. You know, within the Bahamas, we have a lot of uniqueness to our country being an archipelago. You know, we do have challenges communicating, transporting between the islands, but at the same time, we can use this as an opportunity to make sure that we are developing the right skills to meet the needs of our country specifically. Are we training our students to be able to work in telecommunications so that we can have great communications between our islands? Are we training our students to take advantage of our natural resources, like the fishing industry, like the agriculture industry? And these were some of the points that were brought up in your previous panel as well with org. And I think this is so very important as we tie in the economic opportunities with education. We need to make sure that we are looking at how we're planning to diversify and what the specific skills are. You know, going back to Tiffany's point about skills and curriculum, what are the skills that we should be training our students to work towards so that we can have a diverse and robust and resilient economy going forward?
So to me, it's about industry-driven solutions as well. So we have at BTVI, we have program advisory committees that inform us in terms of what it is they want at the end of the day. We actively work with them. And I think the entire education, you know, sector needs to be more cognizant of the importance of the user of the product, if you will, at the end. And I know the same problem exists in Florida and other states in the US as well. So it's not just a Bahamian issue. So in the first instance, as I think we've been talking throughout the panel, there needs to be a coalescence of kind of interests and views in terms of perspective. I certainly agree with the previous, you know, comment about agriculture and other things in the Bahamas needs to be strengthened and has to stand on its own. But there will still be a need, I think, as she mentioned, for, you know, things like tourism, for example. And so tourism as a product will take a while to try to, you know, rebound. And I think the Bahamas has a unique opportunity to try to improve the skills of the people involved in the tourism industry. To me, from an education point of view, what that means, and it's kind of simplistic in a way, but as I look at colleges in particular, it's always like a 12 or a 13 or 14 week model of courses. That's not going to work anymore. It's going to have to be short, focused, you know, courses that are certified by industry. And so we're actually working with City and Guilds right now on a City and Guilds Global Hospitality Certificate. So it would be internationally recognized and could be available to, you know, resorts and hotels throughout the Caribbean, frankly, but in particular in the Bahamas. Because if we're going to open up, and you know, everybody's going to open up and they're going to try to bring, you know, people back with different low-cost packages and things like that, it's going to be a really difficult time. It's going to be critical that we make a differentiation with respect to the Bahamas product, which people will be prepared to come to. It's safe. It's got the great beaches, the great, you know, everything else that it's always had. But, you know, it's going to have those people that are going to make it a unique experience. And I think, as someone mentioned as well, it isn't just about digitization. There's an aspect of emotional intelligence that's involved here. And, you know, even if we social distance, we still have to work, you know, with people. And so there's a lot of different aspects to this situation. I do think, though, that it creates some really unique opportunities for us, and I'm more optimistic than I'm pessimistic about the future in the Bahamas in particular, because I think that, you know, of all countries, the Bahamas is kind of small enough to be able to make some changes where the bigger countries are going to be hard pressed to do it, I think. And there's also great infrastructure in the Bahamas already to be able to make that happen. So, you know, I think there's some things we can do. I think there's a number of things that we're actually doing currently. And as we get into these, I'm more of an optimist to the extent that, as I raised that positive example previously, we can't just lament on the fact that, boy, this is terrible. You know, we've got these two big disasters in the last 6 months. How are we going to get through this? Well, you know, it's up to us to get through it. And I think a series of things need to happen, but I think we're headed in the right direction, frankly.
And I also just, I know you probably want to move on, but I did just want to end. So I had done back now almost 8 years ago, but with IDB and Department of Statistics, we did the big study called In Pursuit of Employable Skills, Understanding Employers' Demands. And it was interesting. The number one type of skill that employers wanted improved, and I don't think that's going to have changed, are soft skills. That was their complaint. It was the top 3 reasons for firing people. The top 3 issues they had with hiring people were not to do with their hard skill sets. It was punctuality, the way that they interacted while they were on the job. It was soft skills. So that is definitely something. I know we're social distancing, but I think just still being able to remember that this is one of the largest things. We then did a whole series of sort of town hall meetings with employers, and we had surveyed over 500 employers. Soft skills, soft skills, soft skills. So while I'm also a big fan of STEM and want to hone down on important technical skills, we cannot forget that that's what employers need. They need people with strong soft skills.
Just to piggyback on that really quickly. Just really quick, I completely agree with that. And I think, you know, one of the big soft skills, and I think especially in this time of COVID, and, you know, we kind of touched on it a little bit when we talk about learning at a distance, is this idea of self-motivation and grit. And I think that's one thing that we need to try and help instill in our student population, and finding ways that we can get students to kind of drive their own learning. And I think that the approaches of like project-based learning and inquiry-based learning help to foster those skills for sure. And, you know, when we're working in this online environment, I think being able to self-motivate yourself to go onto your online tool and learn, or even as like an adult in continuous learning, there's all these options online. Being able to find ways to self-motivate so that you can continuously improve and learn the skills that you need is an important skill in itself for us to try and foster in our youth. So I think in terms of tying education to the skills that we need, that's one that we should really focus on as well. And sorry, Tiffany, I think I cut you off there.
I think Dr. Taylor had wanted to speak, and then maybe Tiffany? Or did I hear that wrong? Okay, Tiffany, go ahead.
Yeah, so just DeAndre kind of picked up on where I was going with this. I think we have 2 really good opportunities right here, one kind of in the short term and one in the long term for skill development. When we talk about, so in the short term, I do think that the government and the greater public has an opportunity to kind of convene a committee that revisits what we've been thinking about as industry. I know that's pretty much been led by the economy and what those numbers look like. And again, the Bahamas has one of those very unique positions that's made us really lazy in innovation, because our proximity to the United States, tourism has really taken off well for us. So we haven't worked as diligently in other areas that we can develop, because we've had all of these opportunities. I think this is a really good time for us to convene a committee that can kind of look toward what are the opportunities that exist now, and how do we open doors for them in that realm. And that framework is kind of like a top-down approach. I think from a school and curriculum perspective, I've always been a fan of, as DeAndre previously mentioned, I've always been a fan of inquiry-based learning. And I think there's an opportunity for inquiry-based learning in our curriculum that helps our students consistently think about what problems we have in the country and what are the solutions to those. And I think that's an opportunity to kind of like think about new industry in a way that is not a top-down approach, and that is not coming from the people who already exist in those spaces, but from people who can kind of see things and life with a fresh set of eyes, and kind of create industry and economy from their lens in a way that we could never see it. So I think there's a 2-tiered opportunity that exists here, one for the short term and one in a very strategic way.
Thank you.
The only thing I think I should add here is the points I made earlier when I talked about creating these small institutes. I think one of the thoughts behind them is that they can be used to help to prepare people for specific needs. And the tie between those institutes and industry can be very, very strong. So that the pairing is almost a one-to-one. The skills needed, the students get it. I think and then also, the likelihood of them putting investment into it would be stronger because it would be a direct investment in their future staff, whether they are employed at that one company or in that sector. The thing that I want to say though is while I do agree with the notion of skills acquisition and development, and I'm not undermining it at all, I think we can't go to the next extreme where we forget that schools are also supposed to provide education, not just training. And so we have to make sure that in all that we do, we don't lose the balance that we need to have so that persons are still educated and then trained. And then we talk about this thing about persons having multiple careers during their time. It's the education that permits you to be able to have that ability to reinvent yourself. And so I just think it's important for us to always keep that in mind.
Thank you. I'm looking at the time. I think that we should start winding down. So as a closing question, I would like to put for each of you in turn to answer, how can we learn from COVID-19? How can we take a lesson from this to improve education for all in the Bahamas? And I guess to keep it as succinct as possible, I suppose if each of you can say your top one or two things that we spoke about today that you think that we can carry forward into the future to improve education for everyone in the Bahamas, for all students in the Bahamas. And Director Taylor, if you can start.
Yeah, that's fine. I could go first. This one is a bit easier for me to answer than some of all of those other questions you asked because I spent over the last few weeks going around to some of those curriculum development, those curriculum teams that put together the content that went on our virtual school. And one of the things that I said to them is that we should be challenging ourselves in seeing how we can utilize that technology that we've worked on, those resources that we've worked on, and that approach, that collaborative approach, so that as we work collectively, we are seeing the quality of the resource that we provide to students, the teaching and learning instruction that we provide to students increase because we're coming together and we're bringing out the best that we can, while at the same time minimizing the work that an individual has to do to produce that product. And if we go in it with that mind, that together we can collaborate, we can produce better quality and at less work, I think that we will get a better education system because teachers will then be able to shift some of the time that they spend in the plan and the preparation of lessons into some of the direct one-on-one support so that learning becomes a lot more student-centered because we are helping students at the point of weakness and the point of need. So that would be the one thing I would want to highlight.
Thank you. And I'm just going to move down my participant list here. DeAndre, your one major lesson or one or two major lessons from this conversation today to improve education for all in the Bahamas.
I would say I guess I have two main points. We touched on it a few times, but I think the biggest thing is relooking at our curriculum, how we teach and what we're teaching. Looking at different methods like project-based learning, inquiry-based learning, so that we can help develop the skills of the student to align with what we really need for our country to diversify our economy. And I think the second aspect is making sure that we are giving all students the support that they need and trying to help allocate those resources to those who really need it by using evidence-based and data-driven decision-making. And so making sure that we do have transparency into, the finances and to the other information that we need so that we can make those decisions. I think those are the two key things that we would need to do.
Thank you. Itwal, from today's conversation, your two main takeaways or lessons to improve education for all in the Bahamas.
So I think obviously in agreement with both the previous speakers, but also just taking in how the pandemic really has, I think, shifted everybody's understanding of how the education system works and what their roles are within it. So parents have a much more heightened awareness of just how important teachers are. I hear that from my friends all the time. But I think the government has maybe even a slightly different perspective of how the communities and NGOs and parents can support teachers within the public system. The private schools understand the importance of the technology providers. Everybody has this greater understanding. And I think individuals also have a greater understanding of the inequities even within their own classes. I know I've heard from friends about like, oh my God, I didn't realize that so-and-so lived in this type of situation. And somehow being able to really bring this greater depth of understanding of what it takes to provide a good education system in the Bahamas can really be a powerful thing for us. Everybody in June always complains, sorry, director, but always complains, oh, look at all these BGCSE results, or look at this, look at that. And there's a lot of negativity. But just as Dr. Robinson has previously said, like, let's really shift and take now all of our enhanced understanding of what it takes to make a good education system work and actually put it to the test and be bold. As Tiffany said earlier, be bold in our way moving forward. I don't remember which particular prime minister who it was, but somebody always used to talk about us being, you know, this small little country and that we can be the best little country in the world. And I really do think this is an opportunity for us to showcase how coming together we can create a better educational system for every Bahamian, not just those with specific backgrounds.
Thank you, Itwal. And I'm going to take a quick break to plug for org. If that's something that interests you, shifting away from an area of complaining to actually, you know, pitching in and finding ways to advocate and use your voice to lend to the effort in a collaborative way, in a way that works with the ministry and that works with private sector. I really encourage you to join org. You can start by, we have an org education Facebook group. So if you want to hop in there and get some kind of conversations going, but we also have an education committee, as Itwal and DeAndre well know, and you know, there might be opportunities there. So back to our usual programming, Tiffany, if you can give us your one or two takeaways or lessons from this conversation for improving education for all in the Bahamas.
Yeah, I think it comes down to grace, vulnerability, data, and flexibility. So I think this is a time where we need to be really gracious and forgiving of each other, because it's a very difficult time. We're doing a lot. There's a lot changing around us, and we need to just like assume the best out of everybody, because that's just really what everybody's giving right now. We also need to be flexible about how things are coming toward us and how we're going to be responsible and how we're going to be responding to those. We need to be vulnerable. We need to be willing to be vulnerable. And so things aren't going to be the same as they have been, and not kind of brace against that, but kind of embrace about what changes, what positivity is going to come out of this that we're not necessarily completely aware of. And that's sometimes okay. Not having a completely calculated outcome is okay. But then also there's data. We are collecting information, but we're also using that information to inform the steps that we move forward with. And we're going to continue to collect and report on that, keeping very specific metrics on our expectations and kind of shift our decisions based on that.
Thank you. And then finally, Dr. Robertson, if you can finish us up with your one or two lessons from our conversation today to improve education for all in the Bahamas.
Well, first of all, thanks to org and the panelists. It's been a wonderful learning experience. There's certainly more than two takeaways, but I'll try to distill it into two. The first one, for me, again, just coming back to something I said earlier, everybody's under a lot of stress. So I'd come back to the fact that people just need to be, be positive and think about what they can do to kind of manage. Don't try to manage things that are out of your control. In terms of the overall panel, though, and the theme, for me, one of the key things would be to think about the fact that a lot of people will be unemployed for a considerable period of time. a very negative kind of statement. However, why don't we look at this opportunity as a chance to skill up? Let's try to put some opportunities for those people to skill up during that period. And I know, as we've heard from from Director Taylor, the budgets are tight, but if someone is not able to go to work, why don't we set up some kind of a system that encourages them to take some courses that they can skill up? And they can skill up in a variety of areas, as we've heard in this particular presentation today. Farming, for example. Let's do some additional farming in the Bahamas to have some homegrown products and really beef that area up, literally. Pardon me for the pun. But in addition, things like solar. I mean, of all places, for crying out loud, we have to have solar energy in the Bahamas. And we're working on that at BTVI, but it would be something I think as a national priority to let's be less dependent on foreign sources of energy and oil, which has given us a lot of problems. Let's control some of the things we can 4, 5, 6 years out there. But also, I think it's really critical, and I know the soft skills are important to this as well, but I just want to leave you with this quote from the McKinsey report that I mentioned earlier, which literally is only a week old. It says, the pandemic poses immense challenges, but the current crisis is also an impetus for governments to accelerate and deliver on their digital ambitions. And, the Bahamas has focused on digital previously. Let's keep moving in that direction. Let's try to ensure that we're a high-tech economy that is diversified and is prepared for the post-COVID-19 economy of the world. So again, I think we're on the right track. I really have appreciated the opportunity to participate today, and I've certainly learned a lot from the fellow panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. I also learned an incredible amount today, but then I'm not an expert like the rest of you. It was my great pleasure, though, to hear your innovative ideas and gave me a great amount of confidence and inspiration to know that we have each of you working towards better education in the Bahamas. To our audience, thank you so much for joining us today. I will say that we were simply overwhelmed with questions this time around. It seems that this is something that the Bahamians are very, very passionate about. So I will apologize to everyone whose questions we didn't get to pose to the panelists. I will say that if you want to continue this conversation amongst yourselves, I will encourage you to migrate to the Org Education Facebook group, where we are encouraging people to have conversations like this and to post content like this so that we can create a conversation that within the org mechanism will also help to inform what we are doing and to work in with the programs that we have going to improve education in the country. And of course, as you know, we do our best to work collaboratively with each of the stakeholders and panelists today, but also stakeholders in this space. So with that said, I thank you again for joining us. I thank each and every one of you on the panel and in the audience for your passion for education in our country and the future of our little nation. I encourage everyone to please stay safe and stay home as social distancing dictates, and have a great day. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Org.
Thank you.